You do not belong in this family."
His family rejected her immediately. The Duke refused to let her go. The first thing Eleanor Ashby noticed about Ashworth Hall was the silence. Not the absence of sound. The house was full of sound, the tick of clocks and the distant movement of unseen servants and the particular acoustic of enormous stone rooms receiving their own echoes. What the house lacked was warmth. Every surface in it had been selected for grandeur rather than comfort, every corridor designed to remind its inhabitants of the institution they inhabited rather than the home. The portraits in the entrance hall watched visitors with the uniform, aristocratic disdain of people who had been dead for 2 centuries and had developed strong opinions about who deserved to be on the premises. Eleanor walked its length beside her mother, Dorothy Ashby, whose navy wool dress was clean and carefully pressed and entirely inadequate for a house of this particular scale. Dorothy's amber-brown eyes, the same eyes Eleanor had inherited, moved along the portraits with the careful hopefulness of a woman who has prepared herself for a difficult encounter and is not yet certain the preparation was sufficient. This had been Eleanor's fear since the morning James Cavendish, Duke of Ashworth, had told her he intended to introduce her to his family. Not fear of the introduction itself. Fear of exactly what she was watching move across her mother's face, the specific expression of someone discovering that the distance between where they came from and where they are trying to go is further than they calculated when they left home. James walked beside Eleanor, tall, dark-haired, his charcoal morning coat immaculate, his steel blue-gray eyes carrying the particular watchful stillness that she had learned over 4 months to read as controlled tension rather than indifference. He had told her the meeting would be simple. He had said this with the flat confidence of a man who had not examined the assumption underneath it. Eleanor had not corrected him. She had folded the information away instead, into the place where she kept things she would need later. Lady Margaret Cavendish was waiting in the blue drawing-room. She stood at its center in black morning silk, 5 years of it, the fabric heavy and deliberate, the onyx brooch at her throat catching the pale winter light from the tall windows. Her silver-white hair was arranged with a precision that communicated, in its very perfection, how little the person being assessed was expected to measure up. Her ice-blue eyes moved over Eleanor with the unhurried thoroughness of an assessment that had already arrived at its conclusion and was now simply gathering confirmatory evidence. Eleanor's dress, good wool but not extravagant. Eleanor's hands, ink-stained from the morning's correspondence. Eleanor's mother, the navy dress, the silver-streaked hair, the warm careful eyes that gave too much away. Dorothy Ashby's daughter. A physician's widow's daughter. Lady Margaret's fingers moved to the onyx brooch. A doctor's daughter, Lady Margaret announced, to no one in particular and to everyone in the room simultaneously. The words carried the flat, precise finality of a gavel striking wood. They required no elaboration. They were a complete sentence in the specific language of aristocratic dismissal, a language in which the full weight of a family's history and its understanding of its own consequence could be expressed in 3 words, with the additional cruelty of making those 3 words sound merely observational. Lady Margaret turned toward the window. Her back was entirely straight. It was, Eleanor understood immediately, a dismissal rather than a retreat, the back presented as the full stop of the sentence. "She does not belong in this family," Lady Margaret finished. The blue drawing-room held the words the way cold rooms hold cold, completely, without dissipation. Eleanor's hands, folded at her waist, went entirely still. This was Eleanor's tell, the one she could not eliminate, though she had tried. Outwardly she absorbed everything, the set of her shoulders unchanged, her spine unchanged, her expression carrying nothing that could be read as wounded. But her hands, which were always in motion when she was at ease, writing, organizing, gesturing through an argument, went completely motionless when the impact arrived. Every emotion compressed inward and invisible except to someone who knew to look for its absence. Dorothy Ashby's hands, beside Eleanor, were not still. They found each other, Dorothy's fingers closing around Eleanor's wrist with the grip of a woman discovering that preparation genuinely does not protect against impact, that the thing you expected to hurt still hurts in the specific place you thought you had armored. Lord Henry Cavendish, positioned near the door in his dark navy morning coat, did not look at either woman directly. His dark brown eyes moved between his mother's turned back and the two visitors with the mildly assessing expression of a young man who has absorbed his family's hierarchies without examining them and has not yet encountered sufficient reason to do so. He said nothing. He lifted his glass of dark brandy and agreed, in the most socially efficient way available to him, with whichever perspective turned out to be correct. James Cavendish had been standing at the drawing room's threshold for the last 12 seconds. Eleanor had not looked at him. She had made a precise and deliberate calculation. Looking at James in this moment would perform something she refused to perform. It would say, "Rescue me." It would say, "I need this to stop." It would say, "I brought this situation with me and I cannot carry it." None of those things were true, and Eleanor Ashby did not say untrue things even with her eyes. James read the room without moving. His mother at the window, back presented. Henry with the brandy glass, opinion carefully withheld. Dorothy Ashby's hand around Eleanor's wrist. And Eleanor herself, standing in the full weight of what had just been said with her hands still and her spine straight and the specific exhausted composure of a woman who had known this was coming and had decided, long before she walked through the door, that she was not going to allow it to reduce her. Something moved in his jaw. A single tightening beneath the skin, quickly controlled. His steel blue-gray eyes found Eleanor's face. She did not look away. She held his gaze with the level, clear regard of a woman who needs no rescue and is communicating this precisely. He touched the third button of his waistcoat, the small, automatic gesture of a man in the act of deciding something, and then his hand dropped and was still. He had decided. The Ashworth Hall entrance was cold in the late afternoon, the stone floor gray pale under the high windows, the winter light pressing through the glass with the colorless honesty of a sky that has nothing to recommend it. Eleanor stood with her traveling bag in her hand. She had packed it in 20 minutes with the efficient economy of a woman who had kept her possessions few and portable as a matter of practical philosophy. The bag was canvas, modest, entirely practical, the bag of someone who did not expect things to be provided and had learned to provide them for herself. She had said goodbye to Dorothy in the guest room above, a goodbye that took longer than either of them intended and ended with Dorothy's hands holding Eleanor's face and Eleanor saying, with perfect steadiness, that she was all right, which was the thing she always said regardless of its accuracy. She crossed the entrance hall toward the front door. The floor was cold through her boots. The portraits watched without comment. At the far end of the hall, barely visible in the dim corridor beyond the staircase, Lady Margaret Cavendish stood in her black silk, motionless, ice-blue eyes on Eleanor's back, her hand at the onyx brooch. Watching the exit being used. Eleanor's hand closed around the brass of the door handle. The door did not open. James's hand, his palm flat against the wood, the long fingers spread, pressed it closed from beside her. He had moved without sound. He was there when the door didn't move, and that was the first Eleanor knew of it. She turned. He was very close. In the ordinary social calculus of late Victorian propriety, he was considerably closer than convention permitted. His charcoal coat was slightly disordered at the collar, he had come quickly, she understood. He had not arranged himself for a presentation. He was simply there, between her and the exit, with the unhurried certainty of a man who has made a decision and is standing in it. His steel blue-gray eyes were on her face. Not on the bag. Not on the door. On her face, with the full, committed attention that she had learned was the most reliable thing about him, the quality that had made her trust him slowly and then entirely. Eleanor held his gaze without performing anything. "Not yet," James said. 2 words. Quiet, unhurried, with no theatrical flourish in them. Simply the truth of something decided, offered without qualification. Eleanor studied him for the 3 seconds it took to be certain she was reading him correctly. This was James's specific gift and James's specific danger. His face offered very little unless you knew precisely where to look, and Eleanor had spent 4 months learning exactly that. He was not performing gallantry. He was not managing the social situation. He was not saying not yet because it was the elegant thing to say in the circumstances. He was saying it because he meant it entirely, and because every line of him, the jaw, the hand flat on the door, the stillness, was saying it simultaneously, and because the look in his steel blue-gray eyes was the look of a man who had been standing in the drawing-room doorway 12 minutes ago making a decision and had finished making it. The traveling bag was still in Eleanor's hand. She had not put it down. She had not put it down because putting it down would say something she was not yet certain she had the right to say, that she believed him, that she intended to stay, that his decision was sufficient to answer her mother's compressed hands and Lady Margaret's turned back and Lord Henry's diplomatic silence and all of it. At the far end of the entrance hall, Lady Margaret had not moved. Her ice-blue eyes were on her son's back now, the specific eyes of a woman who had issued a verdict and was watching it fail to hold. Her fingers pressed the onyx brooch. James had not looked at his mother. He was looking at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the bag in her hand. She looked at the door that was not open. She looked at the man standing between her and the outside world with his hand flat against the wood and his full attention given to her face. She set the bag down. It was not a surrender. It was not a performance of trust she didn't feel. It was the specific, deliberate act of a woman who has assessed a situation from every available angle and arrived at a conclusion she is prepared to stand behind. Eleanor Ashby did not do things by accident. She put the bag on the stone floor of the entrance hall because she had decided that James Cavendish was worth more than the safety of the exit. James's hand came off the door. The door remained closed. From the far corridor, Lady Margaret watched her son and the doctor's daughter standing together in the cold entrance hall, and her hand at the onyx brooch pressed until the pin left a shallow mark in her palm. The west wing of Ashworth Hall contained the family's private rooms, the sitting room where Lady Margaret received her correspondence, the smaller dining room used when the full household was not assembled, the library where the previous Duke had spent 30 years annotating agricultural journals and which had not been properly dusted since. It was in this library that Lady Margaret summoned Lord Henry the following morning, and it was through the partially open door that Eleanor, passing in the corridor with a stack of estate correspondence James had asked her to organize, absorbed the full detail of the family's private assessment without any intention of doing so. She stood in the corridor. Her ink-stained hands held the correspondence. She listened with the complete, disciplined attention of a woman who has learned that information overheard is frequently more accurate than information presented. Lady Margaret's voice carried through the gap with its characteristic precision, never raised, never less than entirely audible to its intended target. She was telling Henry that the situation had progressed beyond what she considered acceptable. That James's attachment to the Ashby woman was the product of an infatuation that would, left to its natural course, resolve itself. That Eleanor was clever enough, Margaret gave this as though it were a liability rather than a quality, but that cleverness in a woman of no family was simply a more refined version of ambition, and ambition in that form was precisely what the Cavendish name had spent 200 years excluding from its bloodline for very good reason. Henry, audible in the pauses, was agreeing with the general principle while gently suggesting that James was not always responsive to the general principle. Lady Margaret's response was that James would become responsive. That she had written to the Earl of Harwick's family. That his daughter, Lady Cecilia, was available and appropriate and that an introduction could be arranged before the end of the month if Henry would cooperate by ensuring James attended the Harwick dinner. A brief silence. Then Henry, choosing the path of least resistance as was his consistent custom, agreed. Eleanor stood in the corridor with the estate correspondence in her ink-stained hands and felt the full, cold specificity of what she had been told in the drawing-room the previous afternoon. She does not belong in this family. Lady Margaret had not been expressing an opinion. She had been announcing a campaign. Eleanor walked to the end of the corridor. She did not alter her pace. She did not compress her hands around the correspondence. She went up the back staircase and into the small room James had given her as a study, a modest room at the east end of the house with a desk and adequate light and a view of the frozen kitchen gardens, and she sat down at the desk and opened the estate ledgers. She worked for 3 hours. She found, in the second hour, a series of discrepancies in the Ashworth Hall household accounts that had been accumulating for approximately 4 years. Not dramatic discrepancies, nothing as blunt as outright theft. The kind of discrepancies that emerge when a household of significant size is being managed by someone who understands the social apparatus of aristocratic life impeccably but has a limited grasp of actual financial mechanics. The staff payments were erratic. The supplier contracts had not been renegotiated in a decade, which was costing the estate approximately £800 per annum above market rate. The agricultural leases on the northern farms were written on terms that disadvantaged the estate substantially and could be renegotiated at the next quarter. By the fourth hour Eleanor had drafted 3 letters, to the primary suppliers, to the estate solicitor regarding the lease terms, and to the housekeeper regarding the staff payment schedule, and had begun constructing a revised household budget for the coming year that would save approximately £2,000 in operational costs without reducing the quality of anything Lady Margaret considered essential to the dignity of the house. She did not bring the letters to James. She left them on the desk. She went down to dinner. James, opposite her at the small dining table, Lady Margaret was dining in her rooms, Henry was out, watched Eleanor across the candlelight with his steel blue-gray eyes carrying the quality of a man who is aware that something has happened and is waiting for Eleanor to decide whether to tell him. He touched the 3rd button of his waistcoat. Eleanor told him about the letters. Not about the corridor. She told him about the suppliers and the leases and the staff payments and the £2,000. She laid it out with the clean, precise economy of a woman who understands that the most persuasive argument is also the most accurate one. James listened without interrupting. He was very good at listening. It was one of the things Eleanor had understood early and trusted completely, that when James Cavendish listened, he was actually listening, not constructing his response while she finished speaking. The candles burned between them. The letters, James said finally, were the right ones to write. He said nothing about his mother. He said nothing about the dinner at the Harwicks. He said nothing about Lady Cecilia or any of it, which meant either he didn't know, or he had made his own decision about it and was not yet ready to discuss the decision. Eleanor filed both possibilities and returned to the question of the supplier contracts. This is the moment in a story when most people would give up. The family has spoken. The verdict has been delivered. The bag was packed and sitting on the stone floor of the entrance hall, and a woman with Eleanor Ashby's pride and Eleanor Ashby's options had every reasonable justification for walking through that door and never looking back at the cold grandeur of a house that had decided, in 3 words, that she was insufficient. She set the bag down instead. She went upstairs and found £800 a year in unnecessary supplier costs and £2,000 in correctable losses, and she drafted 3 letters that would save a family fortune that the family had not noticed was bleeding. This is what this channel is about. Not rescue. Not the fairy tale where someone comes through the door at the right moment and makes the problem disappear. The stories told here are about women who stay because they have decided to stay, and who are worth something far beyond what the drawing room assessment calculated. Subscribe now. You are watching Regent Hearts. Drop a comment with your city and country. We read every one, and this community is built on knowing where in the world our stories find people. Stay. The next part begins in 30 seconds, and Eleanor Ashby is about to discover that the war she is in has a second front she did not map. The invitation to the Harwick dinner arrived on a Wednesday morning folded in a cream envelope bearing the Harwick crest in dark red wax. James brought it to Eleanor's study himself, unusual, given that he typically passed correspondence through the estate secretary. He placed it on the desk beside her current ledger and stood with his hands in his coat pockets and the particular watchful stillness of a man who is presenting information and waiting to observe how it lands. Eleanor read it. She set it down. Lady Cecilia Harwick, she said, without inflection. James's jaw moved slightly. My mother has been corresponding with the Earl. Eleanor looked at the invitation. Her hands rested flat on the desk, not still in the tellway, simply flat. She was assessing rather than absorbing. Are you going? She asked. James looked at her across the desk with his steel blue-gray eyes carrying the specific direct quality that meant he was not going to manage this conversation around her. He was going to have it with her. I am going, he said, if you are going with me. Eleanor held this for a moment. She turned it over the way she turned over every argument she was given, looking for the load-bearing assumption, the place where it would break under pressure. The load-bearing assumption here was that she would be willing to enter a room where Lady Margaret had arranged a very particular kind of comparison, dressed in the best she owned which was still not the best in the room, and stand beside a woman for whom every door Eleanor had ever had to push through had simply been open from birth. Eleanor looked at the ledger open in front of her. At the columns of corrected figures. At the £2,000 she had found in 4 hours that the estate had been losing for 4 years. She knew her own value. She had always known her own value. The question was whether she trusted James's understanding of it sufficiently to walk into a room that had been specifically arranged to demonstrate that she lacked it. She picked up the invitation. "We will need to leave by 7, she said. The Harwick dinner was everything Lady Margaret had designed it to be. The rooms were magnificent, the Harwick estate smaller than Ashworth but more recently renovated, with the particular theatrical grandeur of new money performing its appreciation of old hierarchies. The candles were many and the flowers were hothouse and the assembled guests represented the concentrated cream of the county's aristocratic opinion, all of whom were aware that the Duke of Ashworth had arrived with the doctor's daughter on his arm and had consequently organized their expressions into various configurations of polite astonishment. Lady Cecilia Harwick was everything Lady Margaret could have designed. She was 22, fair-haired, and classically lovely in the specific way of a woman who has been told her whole life that her appearance is her primary negotiating instrument and has organized herself accordingly. She wore ivory silk and diamonds and moved through the room with the practiced confidence of someone who has never needed to calculate whether they belonged somewhere. She was entirely kind to Eleanor, warmly, specifically kind, in a way that was either genuine or the precise social performance of someone who understood that cruelty in this particular room would be noted and found tasteless. Eleanor could not immediately determine which. She filed it as a remaining question and moved on. Lady Margaret, stationed near the dining room entrance, watched James and Eleanor move through the room together and touched her onyx brooch with the particular frequency of a woman whose calculation is not resolving the way she intended. Because what Lady Margaret had not anticipated, what she had not factored into the architecture of the Harwick dinner and the invitation and Lady Cecilia's ivory silk and her 200 years of correct bloodline, was what happened when Eleanor Ashby entered a room. Not entered it beautifully. Not entered it dramatically. Simply entered it and began to occupy it with the specific, unperformable quality that had nothing to do with her dress or her origins and everything to do with the fact that she was genuinely, completely present in every exchange she had, that she listened the way James listened, wholly, and responded with the kind of precision that left people feeling that they had been properly heard rather than socially processed. By the time dinner was announced, 3 separate guests had sought Eleanor out specifically, including Sir Hadley, the county's most significant landowner, who had heard through channels that the Ashworth estate accounts had been reorganized and wanted to discuss whether Eleanor might consult on a similar project for his own property. Lord Henry, near the mantelpiece with his brandy, watched this development with a new quality of attention. Lady Margaret, near the dining room entrance, had stopped touching the onyx brooch and was simply watching. James Cavendish, standing beside Eleanor as Sir Hadley concluded his enthusiastic proposal, did not touch the 3rd button of his waistcoat. He had already decided. The house was quiet after the Harwick guests had departed. Lady Margaret had retired directly from the carriage, moving through the Ashworth Hall entrance with her black silk drawing around her and her silver head perfectly upright and her ice-blue eyes offering nothing to anyone in the entrance hall. Lord Henry had followed her upstairs with the relieved speed of a man who has spent an evening being uncertain which side he was on and is glad to remove himself from the question temporarily. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall in her midnight blue silk, her pearl at her throat, her chestnut hair slightly loosened from its pins after the long evening. She was looking at nothing in particular. She was thinking. James came to stand beside her. The entrance hall was cold and quiet around them, the clocks ticking, the portraits impassive, the stone floor holding the winter's cold in its grain. In this light, the hall was less imposing than it was in the afternoons. It was simply large and old and indifferent. She was very kind, Eleanor said. Lady Cecilia. James looked at the stone floor ahead of them. He was precise with what he did not say, the specific honesty of a man who refuses to manage someone he respects. She was, he said. She is also entirely wrong for me, and she is aware of this, and the kindness you observed is, I believe, genuine rather than tactical. Eleanor considered this. The entrance hall held the silence without objecting to it. Your mother believes otherwise, she said. My mother believes a great many things that are true about the world as it was 40 years ago, James said. His voice was level and entirely without filial resentment, simply the clear-eyed assessment of a man who has spent a long time understanding the person he came from. She is not wrong about those things. She is wrong about what they mean for the decisions I am making now. Eleanor turned to look at him. His steel blue-gray eyes were already on her face, had been on her face, she understood, for the entirety of the conversation. James touched the third button of his waistcoat. Then he dropped his hand, the decision already made, and turned to face her properly. I am going to tell you something, he said, and I am going to ask you to receive it as information rather than as pressure. You are not obligated to respond to it tonight or at any designated point. You are allowed to sit with it and examine it from whatever angles you require and arrive at your own conclusion in your own time. Eleanor looked at him. The very specific quality of her attention was entirely given to his face. I have been watching you, James said, for 4 months. Not in the way of someone assessing a situation. In the way of a man who finds one person consistently more interesting than everything else in the room. He paused once. In the way of a man who has found that the intelligence and the honesty and the specific composure of a woman under circumstances that would undo most people are not qualities he can be educated out of valuing. His voice held its even register. I am not going to tell you that my family's objections are trivial. I am not going to pretend that what my mother said in the blue drawing room was without consequence or that the social reality of what you and I are discussing is a simple one. He met her amber-brown eyes fully. I am going to tell you that I would rather have the complex and true thing, he said, than the simple and convenient one. And I am going to tell you that you are, Eleanor Ashby, the most completely realized person I have encountered in 32 years, and that my family's assessment of your origin says nothing whatsoever accurate about your value, and that I find their assessment incorrect in every specific detail. The entrance hall held the words the way cold rooms hold warmth, carefully. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. The clocks ticked. She looked at the stone floor. She looked at the portraits on the wall, the 200 years of Cavendish faces watching from their frames, the accumulated weight of a bloodline's opinion about who belonged here. Then she looked at James. I found £2,000 in correctable losses in the estate accounts, she said. James's mouth moved, the very edge of something. I also, Eleanor continued, composed a letter to your solicitor about the northern farm leases that will save the estate considerably more than that over the next decade. She held his gaze. I intend to be useful here for a very long time, Your Grace. With or without your mother's endorsement. The entrance hall was very quiet. Something in James's steel blue-gray eyes changed, the specific alteration that happened when the composed surface rearranged itself around something warmer. The thing she had come to understand was the most honest signal he had. His hand came up slowly and he touched the side of her face, his palm against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental in it. Eleanor closed her eyes for 1 second. She opened them. I would like, she said quietly, to stay. James looked at her with everything he had, unheld. Good, he said. Because I intend to make it impossible for you to leave. Upstairs, in the corridor outside the blue drawing room, Lady Margaret Cavendish stood in her black silk in the dark with her hand at her onyx brooch and listened to the silence from below. It was a different silence than the one she had installed. It was the silence of something settled. She pressed the brooch once more and walked back to her rooms. Eleanor Ashby packed a traveling bag. She stood at a door that was about to open. She set the bag down not because someone told her to and not because the circumstances demanded it but because she had examined every angle of the situation and decided that what was behind her was worth more than what was in front of her. She went upstairs and found £2,000 in losses the family had not noticed and wrote 3 letters that none of them had thought to write. That is not a fairy tale. That is a woman who knows her value and conducts herself accordingly, and waits for the people around her to arrive at the same conclusion. This is Regent Hearts. Every week a new story. Every story about a woman who refused to let someone else's assessment of her become her own. Subscribe now if you have not already. Share this with one person who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below with your city and country, we want to know where this found you. The next story is coming. It is worth the wait. We will see you there.